On this computer, I don't trust the cloud.
There it is.
Ahoy, and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and this week I have Tanner Johnson, one half of the Beyond the Breakers podcast. Hello.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming. I like your shirt.
Oh, thank you. That's something I've gotten into more recently is acquiring more clothes, finally.
Are you a fan of a band t-shirts just based off the one that you're wearing?
Yeah, that's most of the new shirts that I acquire recently.
Fair enough.
I don't really wear them out that often. I mean, I wear like business casually type stuff to work, so I don't really have a chance to show them off very much. So Zoom calls are an excellent time to do it.
Sweet. Well, this is a Holy Death shirt in case anyone at home is wondering. Um,
Check them out. They're available on Bandcamp.
there we go. Is it local? Is there a local group to you?
No, they're from LA. Okay. I want to say.
I have no idea. I don't know anything about anything. I've learned.
Yeah, thank God for metal Twitter, because I've just discovered so much on there that I never would have had any reason to discover. And there's just so much great stuff being made right now. Mm-hmm. And you have the people with the mindset that like they stopped making good music like decades ago. And it's like that's just objectively not true. There's more good music out than ever. Bandcamp is a wonderful thing. It's great.
I was actually talking to my brother about this the other day, sort of more in the context of academia, but it's true in this as well, so I was an English major when I went to college, which means, I read the classics. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where, I have now gone through, I have my degree, and sorry, my webcam's glitching out a bunch, anyone at home, so just apologize. Also, I might turn it off at some point to give it a moment to figure its life out. But you read all these things like the classic literature and blah, blah, blah. And it's not to say that there's nothing to learn from them, because I definitely think that there is. It is important to understand, for example, Shakespeare has contributed a lot to pop culture and modern culture. So it's like, yes, I think that, students over the course of their academic life should read one, perhaps two Shakespeare plays for relevance. But I also think that we never update the curriculum. We never give anything new a chance. There is a really, really big gap between sort of classic literature and contemporary literature. And even in terms of classics, you never go back and look at other books of that period and think, I'm just going to pick on a book, for example, but like, hey, instead of teaching Jane Eyre for the 18 millionth time, what's another book of that time period, or even another book by the same author that might have the same. I mean, that's just an example. And I personally didn't like Jane Eyre. Incoming hate. But it's, it's that very, very kind of notion where it's like, it's always been that kind of classic. And it's just in my mind, a way of excluding contemporary things and also stuff of that era that just got overlooked for often no reason.
Mm-hmm. I think focusing only on the classics, you sort of lose a lot of continuity with, and this is kind of a theme that we discuss a lot on our show actually, is that culture changes and technology changes, but people are essentially the same, have the same issues, have the same vices and struggles and everything throughout history. We don't get any nicer or kinder throughout history. But yeah, I think by never updating it, never talking about anything new, you kind of lose the connection, and you kind of see the classics and the people who wrote them and read them as some sort of separate species, when they're just people like you and me. Yep.
And it's really interesting because I think about, we were slightly off, Aaron, right before, and just a moment ago when you mentioned like Bandcamp and Twitter as ways of discovering new things from across the world. And I think that now music and literature and art as a concept as a whole are far more accessible than they were back when you had to like send away for things by carrier pigeon. But, thinking of the whole notion of so much undiscovered talent now, it makes me think back to those time periods as like, who did we overlook just because they weren't popular? But their records haven't been preserved because it wasn't digital. Andrew Artist wasn't famous, so when he died, everyone just like threw away or burned his stuff because it wasn't important. But what if he had been, it turned out, what if he had been like, I don't know, a Van Gogh contemporary? What if he had been better than? We just don't know, because he was like some dude in a factory that painted on the weekends.
And back to what you were saying about Shakespeare, about, obviously that's a huge emphasis in like American high schools. You read Shakespeare and all kinds of stuff. But so much of the context is lost because so much of it's just done through reading, which is like not how these things are supposed to be enjoyed. And so I think, seeing having a chance to see a even a Shakespeare play like performed, or even just the movie adaptations of them, like the Kenneth Branagh ones, I really love those. But just to at least capture the emotion and the humor and things like that. um I was I read a fair amount of books in translation,
Mhm.
and I remember reading a while ago about how Shakespeare's basically this, untouchable, um, inalterable bastion of the English language,
Mhm.
and how if for students who are, say, bilingual, if you're struggling to read Shakespeare and understand it in English, read it in your second language,
Yes.
because the way that it's presented is much more modern and updated. Whereas it would be sacrilege to translate Shakespeare into a more modern form of English. No English teacher would countenance the idea of updating his language. Yeah, it's interesting how we have these idols in English literature that we can't do away with.
Yeah, I think the same is true also in music because, I studied classical music for a long time, and I now realize as an adult that I actually never wanted to study classical music. I just kind of wanted to learn how to do it so I could make my own way, figure out my own path, but that just wasn't an option. I think now, there's more flexibility, especially with, kids exploring creative outlets where you can learn rock or blues or pop music, or you can learn a very specific kind of art, or it's much more available, but that simply wasn't how it was done even when I was young, which is not that long ago. It
Mhm.
was like classical or nothing, and you'll be grateful for it.
Right. um I remember the day in school they had us try out. We could pick three instruments to try out
Ooh,
from band or orchestra, if we wanted to do that. I tried out the violin because everyone was trying the violin. I think I
that's what
tried
I played.
I tried the clarinet, just to because we had to try. We couldn't try three of the same like family of instruments.
Okay.
But I knew from the outset that I wanted to play the cello because of the video game Zelda Link's Awakening,
Okay.
where there's the, I forget what the name of the cello is, but I loved that game, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be a cello player. So I was a cello player for like 2 years, and then kind of similar. I realized like, oh, like I don't actually enjoy the style of music and
Hmm.
like making it, so I gave up on the cello. But
Yeah, I ended up studying violin for 12 years, but I mean, music's really important, and I've discussed it a lot on the show. Where in the movie, Titanic, for obviously the score is really important, and I was noticing it the other day because I think I was talking to I don't remember if it was on the show or not, but we were watching Lord of the Rings, my family and I, and I was joking that we needed two buttons on the remote, one for action sequence volume and one for dialogue volume,
mhm.
because they're so profoundly different. Like I
Right.
was jacking the volume up to listen, especially when they're speaking in Elvish, because they really talk like this. There's a lot of whispering. There's a lot of volume. And then it goes to combat. And
Mhm.
you're just kind of like, what the fuck is actually happening? And it was like, so I was blowing the volume up to 90 to hear
Mhm.
Aragorn and Arwen talking, but then we had to slash it back down to 30 instantly because it would go to an orc fight.
Mhm.
And it's one of those things to me where I was like, the score is beautiful and the sound effects are great, but you lose half of them because of this awful
Mhm.
balance in volume.
Yeah, it's hard to enjoy it when you've got to always be sort of on edge, waiting to adjust the volume.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that happens to me with Marvel movies too. Not as bad, but they can be pretty intense.
I don't think I've ever actually seen one. I
That's
feel like
impressive.
I feel like I feel like I've seen part of the like the first Iron Man, because I want to say it was like the last week of school and our teacher was just playing movies on the TV.
Right.
So, but I think that's the only one I've seen,
Mhm.
um that I know of, at least. Um
I will say that it's not as bad as Lord of the Rings when it comes to volume differentiation. It's still pretty loud, but it is.
I thought you were talking about like in quality of movie at first. I was like,
Oh, just
hey
sound,
now.
just sound. Yeah, I've also touched on this on the show before as well about the Marvel movies, and that I'm like, they're at this point. First of all, there's so many of them. I
Mhm.
think that having so many of them, and they usually kind of follow the same formula in terms of how they look and how they sound, There's some variants and other things, but they're very formulaic. So at some point it becomes hard to tell them apart. Like I was
Hmm.
talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about again these Marvel movies, and I was like, "Yeah, I like this one, but I don't remember if it was the third or the second Thor." But it was
Hmm.
like I just they're all one in
Yeah.
my brain, which isn't great, especially when there are so many, because it leads it hard to be like, well, I liked this movie, but I didn't like this movie, or did I like
Hmm.
this movie? I don't know which movie was that, and it's hard to then find moments that are like worth remembering because they're just this all over.
Yeah, I don't partake myself, but I'm not one of the people that like objects to the existence of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Mm-mm.
Um, I mean, because a lot of the critiques of they're formulaic, they're all the same, there's too many of them, whatever. It's like, okay, you're also describing the novels of Sir Walter Scott. So, and I love those, so go for it. Um, it
Yeah,
there's always that kind of media that, if I was a fan of them, I would love the fact that there were so many of them. Keep making
sure.
more of them. Yeah.
Well, I will say, so I'm a Star Wars fan, and
Hmm.
I'm getting to the point where I'm like, they need to stop making stuff. And it's not because I don't like that there's content as a
Hmm.
concept. I'm like, ooh, new Star Wars stuff, an excuse to play with a lightsaber. Excellent. But it gets to the point where number one, there's just too much.
Hmm.
And it gets to the point where, especially with something like Star Wars, the MCU, where they don't come out in like timeline order, they come out in whatever order they come in. It's like, okay, where does this fit into the timeline? Does it fit into the timeline? Is this relevant? Did that
Hmm.
happen? It gets a little like trying to reconnect your wires. And also, I do think you start to lose a bit of your quality.
Hmm.
Like, did you see Kenobi, the TV show?
No, the most recently made Star Wars that I have seen in its entirety is Attack of the Clones.
Okay,
So that was kind of like towards the end of when I was interested in Star Wars,
fair
and
enough.
I actually really liked those movies because
Mhm.
like the prequels, because I was a little kid. I was like perfect age to
Yeah.
enjoy Jar Jar Binks and some of the zanier elements of those. And obviously I love Darth Maul. But yeah, like I don't quite remember why, but just like when Revenge is it Revenge of the Sith that
I
came
think that's the
after?
last one.
Um,
Yep, you're right.
I remember that coming out and just not having any like desire to like go see it, and I don't remember why. I still like Star Wars, I still enjoy it, but I haven't really been plugged into it in a long time.
I recommend. My brother got me into it, and I really liked it. I liked the animated Clone Wars show. I thought that was really, really good.
Those I have seen some episodes of those. I enjoyed those, some of the like kind of the side stories from characters that I recognized from reading the books and stuff was cool.
Speaking of
um
Maul, the finale of the show has one of what I will say in the Star Wars universe to date is one of the coolest lightsaber battles between Maul and Ahsoka.
that's
And
cool. I would watch
it's
that.
I would look that up isolatedly on YouTube. It's actually super cool.
I would check that out.
Really well done. The graphics are really like they got in a stunt, they probably definitely got in a fight choreographer, and they definitely paid attention to the visuals and everything. It's just really well done.
Hmm.
Um, that's just cool to watch. I mean, no plot necessary. Just be like, Jedi versus Sith, cool battle,
Right.
A plus. But all I was gonna say about Kenobi is that the plot was fine, but there was just so much freaking filler for
Mm.
those episodes. And I heard somebody made like a fan cut where they just chopped it down to a movie length thing, and apparently it's supposed to be really good. And we're like, oh, when you take away all that bullshit, it's actually a good, nice.
Excellent.
Yeah, and that's what it's kind of like. Yeah, you don't need when you start producing so much content, there has to be a lot of filler just because it's out of necessity. Everything has filler. Every movie, every TV show has a little bit of filler. It's necessary for coloring the world.
Hmm.
But when you make 75 movies in a year and then take the total number of filler that you have for that and compare it to someone who made 2 movies in a year, it's going to seem excessive.
We'll uh we'll make and release the Beyond the Breakers cut of Titanic, and it's only things directly related to the sinking of the ship. Nothing else.
Nice.
No human interaction, no love stories, nothing.
I think
Just ship.
somebody has done that. Somebody has made I think it's called the Titanic historical cut, where they
Oh.
cut out all the modern day and I think the romance plot and just follow the historical events and the sinking. First of all, I think it's only 90 minutes long, so it's way easy to watch.
you um I do also think that like the whole like cutting out the romance thing is like a very much like like what a fifth grade boy would do to the movie Titanic. Like, I don't want any of this stuff. Like, get this
It
out of
was
here.
kissing girls.
Yeah, gross. Um, and so yeah, I do appreciate the movie. I haven't seen it that
Mhm.
many times. I think I've only seen it probably twice in its entirety, and I think the most recent time was probably in college.
Mhm.
I did consider rewatching it before coming on here, so I had
Eh.
ability to discuss a little bit better. Um, but instead last night, my wife and I, we watched Barbarian,
Ooh, okay.
which I really enjoyed. Um,
My mom just got me into the show on Netflix called The Extraordinary Attorney Woo, which is it's a K-drama, like
mm,
dramedy, about an autistic lawyer getting her first job.
mm,
It's very
that's
cute.
interesting.
It's really cute. It's very funny. I like it.
Did you watch 1899?
Yes, I did. Did you hear that they canceled it like 22 minutes after it was like fucking released on Netflix?
Yeah, because I had seen that like before I knew that
Mhm.
going in that it was not planned to have a second season.
Oh, what'd you
Um,
think? Knowing that,
I really enjoyed it.
I liked it as well.
I was kind of hoping that like it at least had some sort of
Yeah.
wrap up. Um, and yeah,
Well, here I'm going to put a blanket spoiler alert. We're just going to discuss 1899 in depth if you want to.
oh yeah. I liked the way I kind of liked the relatively slow transition from like period piece
Mhm.
to totally not like this is totally something different, and then obviously like the final scene you realize I'm what was I watching the
Mhm.
whole time. um and yeah, I like I said, I think I said this on when I mentioned it in the intro to one of our episodes,
Mhm.
that it's a great series for many reasons, but especially for someone who's interested in languages, because you get to hear
Yes.
all kinds of different stuff.
So many there's so
And
many languages.
and not just done as like flavoring, like you have whole sequences that are happening, in Danish or in German.
Mhm.
And it's not just there to establish like, hey, this character is German, this character is French, whatever. Yeah, I really enjoyed that part of it. I thought it was really cool.
It seemed realistic to me of what would have happened during that time if you went on an international voyage. You would encounter people who did not speak the same language, and
Mm-hmm.
you didn't have, Google Translate or what had you. You had to make do. You try to find language. You'd be like, you speak German, I speak English, but we both took French in school, so we can have that tiny little
Mm-hmm.
petit peu, concession. But it was realistically done, as you said. It wasn't just to be like this person's German. It's like, no, this family is Danish, therefore they're going to speak in Danish to each
Yeah, because
other.
I feel like other things where you had such a multinational group of characters, you'd hear like, they might have a quick exchange in Danish and
Mm-hmm.
then switch to English in a Danish accent.
Yes.
Now that we've established that this person is from a different country. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know a lot of the obviously we have a relatively curated Twitter feed to ship enthusiasts, but a lot of the stuff that we saw people saying about it were really positive.
Mhm.
I'm sure like anything, there was people who hated it, but I thought it was cool.
I really liked it, and I also liked how, at least for me personally, I liked how it, like, the first time that we saw Lara, was her name? Oh God, I've now forgotten the main character's name. The
Oh,
girl, the woman,
what is her name?
her name. But the first time we saw her in 1899, I remember the first thing I thought was she's wearing clothes from the wrong time period, and it was like she looked reasonably in place. It was still quite modest, but it was just something
Mm-hmm.
I happened to notice. It was like interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then we encountered the young woman presented as a geisha, and the woman she spoke to, and then I noticed was like they're speaking Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
It's not Japanese. It's little tiny hints that just let you know from the beginning that things are about to be slightly unsettling.
Right.
However, if you don't, I'm sure there's a bunch of other quote unquote unsettling details that I didn't notice because they weren't things I was tuned into. I
Mm-hmm.
watched a lot of anime growing up. I know what Japanese sounds like. Like, that's the only reason I knew that. And, the period clothing was just like, that was like a lucky guess where I was just like, I'm really into Titanic. And that looked a little too modern. And
Mm-hmm.
also the way that she like carried herself and walked, she strode rather than walked. Or was like, that's a modern woman's thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was little
Um,
details like that I really liked.
yeah, yeah, that was really great. I hope that it gets rescued, um, like
Same.
similar to what happened with The Expanse,
Mhm.
which got canceled and then brought back. So maybe someone will do that with 1899.
I hope so. But what's also interesting is that I finished it before number one, before I knew there was any talks of a season two. So when I watched it, I for some reason thought it was a standalone miniseries. I made an
Mhm.
assumption. So when it ended, I remember it is the kind of ending where I was thinking like they could make that into a sequel, but also that could just be like one of those endings where you're like, what?
Yeah.
Okay. So if it doesn't get rescued, it does quote unquote have an ending, but it would be really nice to see because I have a feeling that I didn't see Dark, but based on the chitter chatter buzz that I saw around everyone who did see Dark, it does seem like they're the kind of team that has plans and grand designs. But I have to admit, I'd be a little disappointed if they didn't go back to the ship because I'm way less interested in the space and the sci-fi.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, me too. If they were gonna go back into a ship simulation, that would be my thing. Otherwise, I don't know. I might still pursue the story and see what happens, but
Right.
yeah, definitely like that's what got my attention was I want to watch this series about a steamship.
Yeah, I remember the poster came out and I was just like, I'm so sorry. A doomed luxury liner with four funnels in around 1900. Yeah, I think I'm there.
Yeah. Uh,
So oh man, I'm doing this thing lately where I wait a million years to actually ask my first question, which is, what is your Titanic story? And that doesn't necessarily mean the movie. Most people assume the movie, but I just mean
mhm.
Titanic as the whole.
Yeah, I mean, my first exposure to what the Titanic was
Mhm.
definitely came via the movie, but not through seeing it necessarily, just because like so many people were talking about it
Right.
and just kind of absorbing it through osmosis. You know, people talking
Sure.
about it at school, um, the girls at school talking about Jack and Rose, um, stuff like that. So yeah, I don't remember consciously seeking out information about the Titanic, but it's just such a pervasive thing that it you learn about it, whether
Right.
you choose to or not necessarily. Um, and then yeah, like with us even having this podcast, I was never interested in shipwrecks. Taylor's always been interested in shipwrecks as long as we've had interests, um, but never super interested in the Titanic necessarily.
Mhm.
I know we did have the Titanic board game growing up.
Right.
Um, the one where you're like you each get assigned a character and you have to get off the ship. We played that a lot. Um, Taylor was always the Irish guy. I remember that. I don't think I had a favorite character. Um, but yeah, aside from that, like I didn't really have a huge exposure to it. I probably didn't see the movie in full till I was like 13 or 14.
Mhm.
And I remember enjoying it. I remember it being much more interesting than I expected it to be. I expected it to be like, oh, I guess I should watch this because it's just cultural knowledge I should have. But I really
Mhm.
enjoyed it. There was a lot more to it than the kind of like bland love story that I was kind of expecting. And again, I was like probably 13, so like I wasn't necessarily looking for like a deep, touching film to watch. It was like I want action. I want
Right.
shipwreck. So yeah. Aside from that, yeah, I I've never really been a shipwreck person until the last few years doing the podcast, and I think the big thing for me was what you talk about a lot on your show is that um, this isn't a shipwreck. This is a human story. This is humans
Mhm.
doing things. This is humans making decisions, and humans, existing in their larger environment. So, and those are kind of the stories that really draw me still about them is what is the context that this is happening in, what's happening in these people's world, um, who are these people on the ship. That was something I really enjoyed when we did our Lusitania 4-part series. Or
Which I is great, and I highly recommend anybody listen to
five.
us.
There is a secret VIP fifth episode on Patreon, and so we did that. And one of my favorite parts was
I don't know why that noise was the reaction. I'm sorry.
I was gonna go with it. It's fine.
I did, and then I was like, that was really embarrassing. Why are you a pigeon? Please continue.
um, um, where was I?
There was a fifth
Um, oh
portion
right,
about.
I really enjoyed because in one of the episodes we go more in depth about some of the people who are on board,
Mhm.
and that was really fun to learn about. What were these people's careers before they got on Lusitania, and after for the ones that survived,
Right.
and the names that they're in all the lists of, say if you go on Wikipedia, the list of notable or famous passengers who were on board. And the fact that each of those people was a brother or a sister or a mother, a son, and kind of reading about the impact that that person had, not just on society as a whole, but on a smaller scale, their family, and their friends. And yeah, getting into some of the aftershocks of these. One of the things we talked about in our bonus episode was the Lusitania riots in Britain and South Africa, that occurred shortly after the sinking of the Lusitania. Basically, as soon as the news got to these places.
Ooh, this is not something that I knew about.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and these weren't massive earth-shaking upheavals, but you had a very an interesting societal thing happening where you have all these disparate groups sort of solidifying around hatred of this one group of people, the Germans. But of course, especially in a place like Britain, most of those Germans living in Britain, they're there for a reason, and it's because they don't like what's happening in Germany. They don't like this growing militarism that led to this war. And you see this sort of lashing out against the other that has been deemed acceptable to look down on and degrade. And so you've got shops being smashed, merchandise being destroyed. The interesting thing to me with those is that there was relatively controlled aggression. You don't have stories of people being assaulted or killed. I don't think anyone was killed in the whole process. It is purely directed at property, just kind of this symbolic action of feeling powerless and wanting to do something about it. So I'm going to go smash Herr Krautmann's watch store. Yeah, so that was a really fun thing to research. I had never heard of that either before we started doing the Lusitania.
It's really interesting what you learn once you start looking into things. And on my episode with Stephen Beale, and basically on every episode since, I always bring up his book, which is less about there we go. Tanner's just got a copy to show me.
I came prepared.
Mine's upstairs. I'm pointing in its general direction. It's there somewhere. But it was one of those things where it's, again, it's not really about the Titanic. It's about what the world was like surrounding it. And it just adds a lot of color and context that you did not have, that make you understand things way better, and often in a disappointing way, where you learn things about society where, as you said, we don't get any nicer through history. It's like, I bring it up often that there's a cartoon of, I think it was Archie Butt holding a gun on people, and it was like, Archie Butt holds gun on third class Italians. It's like, you gotta throw that one in there, because there was super strong, like you were talking about, anti-German sentiment at the time. There was really strong anti-Italian sentiment in the United States, and maybe elsewhere.
Back to the to say a little bit more about Down with the Old Canoe. What I thought was, I read that a little bit, I guess it was like in the opening stages of starting the Lusitania series is when I was reading that. And he gets in, almost right away to the discussion of the impact that the Titanic and the survivor stories had on, the role, or the, I guess I'll say the role of women in society. And the impact that this had on things like the suffrage movement. And that was just never a connection that I would have conceived of. And it seemed very modern. Like many of these stories that we research do, you see a lot of the same ugly parts of these disasters, where you'd think this big disaster, you'd think that people would all come together and support each other. But it's like, in modern society, we know that's not what happens.
Right.
Every time there's a school shooting in America, which is like every week now, that's absolutely not what happens. Why would it be any different with this? And you see that divide of saying that, well, because of the women and children first rule, all these women survived, so therefore women need to be protected and don't need to be able to vote. And it's like, that is not a chain of logic that I would have drawn from that. But
it's really wild when you do consider things like that, and also when you consider who tells the story at the end of the day, where it's like, History's always usually been told, especially in the United States, by like white Christian men. So of course they're
Mhm,
going to extol those virtues.
mhm,
And you go back and look through history, and it's like, of course, that often doesn't lead to a flattering portrayal of, as you said, the other, because
mhm.
why would it? In
Uh,
order to make themselves look super genteel, it's like the Italians were rioting, and we stood there with guns and let the ladies escape. We are men.
right. Um, I was gonna make a connection off of that.
Me too.
The other thing from that was mentioned in Down with the Old Canoe was the writer Albert Hubbard, and I used his writing in our Lusitania episode because he had written pretty effusively about the Strausses and
Mm-hmm.
how they were this paragon of perfect husband and wife. This is what good Christian love looks like. This is how you should behave. If you're a wife, you should be going down with your husband on this sinking ship. Um, and why I think it's funny is because on the Lusitania, Albert Hubbard gets a chance to nut up and do it, and he does. He and his wife go down on Lusitania together. But it's just very interesting to see a situation where someone's writing about this with a concrete example, but kind of just in the abstract of saying this is how you should behave.
Mm-hmm.
And then he finds himself in the same situation a few years later.
This very much reminds me of like, this is very extreme, but like the bridal burnings in India, where they're like, if the woman is widowed, it's like, well, of course you should throw yourself on the
Mm-hmm.
pyre. What the hell is the point of living without him, you absolute whore?
Mm-hmm. It's we discussed that concept. We didn't make that exact connection, but I did think of those things. I definitely did think of that when
Mm-hmm.
the way that it's written about, because I think
Yeah.
that's a very it's a very personal decision. I In that situation, of course, it makes sense that if you and your husband are together, like of course maybe you want to go down together. Makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
You be you. I'm not gonna harsh anyone's vibe about
No.
drowning with your spouse. But the way that it's presented as a pattern, something to emulate, like you must do
Yes.
this,
Yes.
otherwise, did you really even love this person?
Right. You
Whereas
weren't
it
a dutiful wife.
right, so I think um, obviously, I think many people in that situation, and Taylor pointed this out, would be like, no way in hell are you staying on this ship with me. Get on the lifeboat. Like
Yeah.
one of us has to survive. The kids need you. The grandkids need you. So yeah, that interesting stories with them, uh, with all of those things connected.
Mm-hmm.
Also, always going on more tangents here. I you learn lessons doing this reading, and sometimes you keep on clicking the blue links on Wikipedia in everyone who has a story. And so I started reading about Isidore Strauss, and I shouldn't have. Well, maybe I should have. Um,
Oh, do
l-
tell.
learning that, like, I'd say if people know Isidore Strauss, they probably know him from the Titanic. Like that's kind of what he's famous for now. But
And
like,
Macy's, right?
right, so he was involved with that. But like, as a younger man, he was also like heavily involved with the Confederacy, and like an active. I believe he actively owned slaves, but he definitely was like an ardent supporter of the Confederacy. So like, it's one of those things where you see like you see kind of the lionized version of someone, and then like you read about it, it's like, oh well, this guy was like kind of shitty.
Mm-hmm. Well,
But like,
minorities can be bad because they were Jewish.
it's like,
It's like
yeah,
minorities can be bad people too.
yeah, it's like there's tons of evil to go around, and
Yeah.
like the admirable qualities don't cancel out the other ones, but
No.
like I don't know, they coexist within
Yeah.
everyone basically. Everyone has the potential to do good and bad things, and really what you get famous for, I don't know, it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
No one remembers Isidore Strauss as a Confederate sympathizer or supporter.
I'm
Everyone
going
remembers
to
him.
now.
Everyone remembers him as a noble gentleman who went down with the ship.
Yeah, and I think that he and Ida, in the movie Titanic, were the old couple in the
Mhm,
bed. They weren't named in the movie, but that was supposed to be them. So they are, as
mhm.
you said, this like virtuous pinnacle of how people are supposed to be. This is love and devotion, and as you said, Hubbard wrote that like this is what you should do.
Hmm.
But what I found also really interesting is that they talked about how they were good Christian people, but it's like they're actually Jewish.
Right. Yeah. The quarter sort of like claiming of something where if it's a virtue, it must be white Christian people
Mm-hmm.
doing it, and we have to find some way to wrangle them into that. Otherwise, it's not virtuous.
Right.
Um, I was just doing a quick double check on Isidor Straus, and actually, I should have mentioned him in our last bonus episode because he was also involved with blockade running in the Civil War. I totally should have made that connection. Um,
That doesn't surprise me.
but anyway, in 1861, he was elected officer in a Confederate military unit, but was not allowed to serve because of his youth. So that's why he got into blockade running.
Ah,
Um, so yeah, big Confederacy head, Isidor Straus. I don't know that he was actually a slave owner. I might be slandering him by saying that, but he's
I
not
mean, if you
great.
sympathize with the Confederacy, even if you
Right.
don't own slaves, you definitely you're gonna side with them.
Coming down on the decision, Isidor Straus, not squeaky clean.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'll say. I don't want to slander any of these good people or anger the Strauss heads. So
Oh, I just say things, but I think people have now figured out that I'm a moron, so they can't really hold it to me that often. I'm like, look,
mhm.
I just say stuff. Um, it was really interesting when you think about the history of any sort of disaster. It makes you kind of go back and look at the people that were involved. Because at the end of the
Mhm.
day, I think that's what's most interesting. I mean, obviously the ship going down and what happened is crazy, but it's interesting to look at how who was on board, how did they react, what happened to them, what does the record say, what do people think happened to them, and it's like a lot of what people thought for a long time came directly from Lightollers' testimony because he was the highest surviving officer. And then, you go back and realize that, yeah, maybe for the most part he was telling the truth, but you also then realize he was a company head. Like he
Mhm.
needed to stay with the White Star Line. That was his entire life. You go in there and talk down on them, Cunard may not pick you up after because even if you're a good sailor, they might be like, yeah, but you threw White Star Line under the bus when you were their
Right.
officer. What are you going to do to us if something happens?
Mhm.
So it's like one of those things where you have to look at the historical context of like, yeah, he just went through a bunch of trauma, but still needed to feed his family.
Mhm.
So that's a thing. Just punched my microphone.
I feel like I was going to spin something off of that, but I think I've lost my thread of thought here.
Lost the yarn.
Yeah.
Eh, well,
What
I
else did
mean,
I talk about? Oh, the other since talking about some Lusitania connections with
mhm,
Titanic, and there are quite a few of them. Obviously, similar time, similar
yeah.
type of vessel.
I think
Um,
that obviously Titanic launched and sank in 1912, but the Lusitania launched, I just looked it up about like 5 minutes ago. It launched in '06 and it went down in 15.
mhm.
So
And
you're
so
right,
yeah, I
exactly around
mean,
that time.
similar people traveling on them. I mean, the best example being Alfred Vanderbilt,
Hmm.
who was supposed to be on the Titanic and canceled his trip. I think because his mother told him to cancel it.
Hmm.
Um, one of the richest people in the world, still listening to your mom. Um, and It's good advice. Listen to your mothers.
Agree.
Um, but yeah, so he was kind of considered lucky for not being on the Titanic, and then he ends up on the Lusitania when it sinks. So he was gonna die in a shipwreck. It was it was predetermined. The fates had spun his thread, and it
They had
involved the
spoken.
shipwreck. Um, and yeah, even just the entire mindset that was generated by the Titanic in terms of what does a shipwreck look like? How does a shipwreck happen with it one of these big liners? Because you have a lot of people, when the Lusitania is struck by the torpedo, a lot of people don't think she's going to sink at all,
Right.
because it's one torpedo. This is a massive ship. What is that? That's not a fatal injury to this vessel. And even the ones that do have concern about it sinking, they think they have a lot more time
Yeah.
than they do. Taking that model of the Titanic, saying we've got what 2 hours and 40 something minutes to get off, so we can go back to our cabin, we can gather up all of our stuff, and then we can very orderly make our way to the lifeboats. And that's not at all what happens with Lusitania. They've got
No.
eight 18 minutes from impact to being underwater. And
Which
some
sounds
people,
like a long time, but when you genuinely consider it, especially when you're in a panic, 18 minutes is 4 minutes. It's like 4 seconds.
mm-hmm. um, and yeah, all the complications that come with, I mean, the ship's listing so heavily, getting to, I mean, most of the lifeboats can't be deployed.
Nope.
So yeah, just the way that sort of primes people's imaginations for if something happens on a ship, what does this look like?
Mm-hmm.
There's the famous quote from Margaret Mackworth where she says, you know, I always thought that a shipwreck was a very organized affair. Or and her friend says, you know, I thought so too, but I've learned a devil of a lot in the last 5 minutes. Um, yeah, it's great to see what did people think about this and how did the Lusitania change those perceptions.
I have like 17 questions based off of that quote. And the first and foremost is which, how did you think anything with the word wreck in it was orderly?
Well, and that's the thing is that like
I'm lost on this one.
There's so many parallels or similar things that, you know, where that would seem to support the idea. Thinking about stories like the Birkenhead sinking off of South Africa, where, you know, they've got time to get organized. You've got the famous image of all of the redcoat soldiers lined up, mm-hmm. going down with the ship, you know, in supposedly lined up in rank and file. That's at least how it's depicted. And you have this thing where all of the women and children get off and all of the men stay on board and die with the ship. Even stuff like the Central America, which was it was transporting gold from California, and it sank in, I think it sank in the Gulf of Mexico. And you also had a moment where
I bet that wasn't a big loss for the company at all.
It some sources credit it with starting the Panic of 1857.
Yeah, like I said, not a big deal at all.
Yeah, that's not totally true. But it was like, it would have been on people's minds that, hey, like this big ship of gold was totally lost. We had that one, and that happens over the span of several hours where there's breaks in the storm. They're able to get people off and get them to other ships before it finally sinks. So there is precedent for that idea that this is something that we have time to process and, you know, plan the best course of action, rather than we just need to get off the ship. Like, we can't go back to our cabin. We can't get anything. You know, because you had some people who would go back and fortunately they only grabbed, you know, their life belt or their life vest, mm-hmm. and they just got out. But yeah, a lot of people didn't, because they thought they had time to do a little bit more. So
I guess I was while you were talking, I was thinking, I was like, why would anyone assume that? But then I realized, like, I grew up in the era of TV and radio news. So, you know, when there was and also with gasoline engines. Mm-hmm. So when there was a car accident, people need to evacuate because, you know, there could be flames. Mm-hmm. Same thing with a train, same thing with a plane, any kind of crash. It's like, first of all, the element of danger is increased because there's a lot of electronics and gasoline on board. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we have the news coverage. So it's like, we all know now what a wreck looks like. So I always grew up thinking, like, car crash, train crash, plane crash, ship crash. I'm like, these are all big deals, because I didn't have stories that were, you know, I didn't just open a paper and hear like Titanic strikes iceberg, 1200 die, 700 survive. And yeah, you could think based on the way there's like, oh yeah, hit an iceberg. Everyone was like pretty solemn and panic, got on their lifeboats. Like, I can see where if you had never been exposed to, you know, TV news footage or something, why you wouldn't necessarily think that, because you've been exposed only in writing.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, another thing is just like the enormous size of these ships, and just the way that gives them this aura of invulnerability. With the Lusitania, it was her speed more than anything that made people think this ship, I mean, this is obviously wartime that they're concerned about. So they're thinking, like, there's no way a U-boat could even attack this ship because it's way too fast. And that was its primary mode of defense. And that gave people a lot of, it made people feel very good, because there were the, you know, discussions swirling around before it left of, hey, like, the Germans said they're going to be sinking ships over here by the British Isles. And the response is, oh, like, well, good luck catching us, basically. And there you go. So yeah, and obviously there's extenuating circumstances, because like Lusitania wasn't traveling at her full speed. She didn't have all of her boilers active. So there's things there, but what was I going to say? She did have enough lifeboats. That was
Hmm.
fortunate, thanks to people realizing that that's something they needed. But again,
Hmm.
it didn't matter how many she had because
Right.
I think only 6 were deployed, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, it's either 2 or 6. That's a pretty big range, but it's one of those numbers.
I mean, either way, it's not enough.
Right. And the ones that were deployed,
Yeah.
only I think 2 is the number I'm thinking of that successfully were able to get away from the wreck. Um,
Lusitania was devastating, quick, brutal, and devastating.
yeah, and kind of back to the invincibility thing is the idea that like people didn't totally believe that that would be done. Like there's no way a U-boat captain would actually sink a passenger vessel. Like one that's clearly a well-known ship. This is
Right.
definitely a passenger vessel. The idea that that gives it an extra layer of protection.
Yeah, it would be like if, during active war, if targeting a Princess Diamond cruise.
Right. Yeah, something that for sure, regardless of what else it may or may not have on board, whether you
Right.
think it is transporting munitions, it's also got like thousands of people on it that are civilians.
Right. It's a passenger
Um,
vessel.
yeah. Um, that was cool reading about kind of the other side of things from the U-boat captain perspective,
Hmm.
in that Walter Schwieger, the captain of the U-20 that sank Lusitania, he often gets excused for the fact that, well, this was a declared war zone. He was a U-boat captain. What do you expect him to do? But the U-boat captains had quite a bit of autonomy. I mean,
Hmm.
who's out there looking over their shoulder to tell them what to do?
Right.
And
You're
there's
the
plenty
captain of your vessel.
and plenty of U-boat captains would not have sunk the Lusitania, saying this is a
Yeah.
passenger vessel. That's not a legitimate target. Even if it is a legitimate target, I don't want that on me. Um,
Right. That's not for my soul. Like, I'm not that interested in hearing about how I ended a family's legacy for the rest of my life. I'm good.
yeah. So the idea that his hands were tied is absolutely ridiculous.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, there's all the legalistic elements that we got into about, was it technically legal or not? Um, Obviously, the general consensus in the English speaking world is no. And even in most of the modern German speaking world, the answer is no,
Hmm.
just because of our modern conceptions about these things.
Right.
Uh, but the other thing we got into was talking about, the British blockade on Germany
Hmm.
and the optics of those two things, where blockade killing people through starvation is inherently just as wrong as sinking
Yep.
a liner full of people. It's just that one is much more tangibly an act of war,
Yeah.
than the other one seems to be for most people, because it's much harder to see the effects of a blockade and the effects of
Yeah.
starvation, or like what we love to do is sanctions, economic sanctions on countries that we disagree with, and the idea that it's somehow better or kinder than this other more visible method of warfare, when in fact, like, you're still killing people, you're still
Hmm.
killing innocent people, and no one really has clean hands in that situation. So, I guess long story short, man, World War One was a complicated thing.
So I was recently reminded of a movie that I've seen one, maybe two times, and I don't think I can ever watch again because it's very much about the devastating brutality of war on people, civilians, and that is Studio Ghibli's Grave of the Fireflies.
I've heard
Um,
about it, but I've never seen it.
oh my God. Oh my God. That will ruin you, but it is a tremendous film. Even people that don't like animated films, so I guess one of the best war films made. Um, and it is done in this animated style, but it very much focuses on like the toll that it takes on normal people.
Mm-hmm.
It follows two children who are orphaned after, during World War II, they just bombed a bunch of villages in Japan. They lose their mother in the bombing, and it's about how they, no home, no mother, father's away fighting at war, and they later find out that once the Japanese lose, that all the high commanders were probably killed, so their father's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the little girl is 13, is 3, and he's like 12 or 13. It's like young. So it follows these two and just kind of shows the devastating effects of war, because eventually the little girl dies of starvation
Mm.
because they can't get food. They don't have
Right.
food. And it's that kind of thing where at the time it came out, there was a lot of reception going around that, especially in the United States, was like as an anti-war film because, we did it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like, it's not exactly an anti-war film. It just goes to show that no matter what side of the equation you're on, people will get hurt, no matter
Mm-hmm.
how justified or not. Like these two kids are fictional, but women and children who were just struggling to survive in tiny villages didn't do anything.
Yeah, it's like it connects to the same sort of mentality that we talked about with the
Yep.
Lusitania riots, um, saying the Germans sank the Lusitania, and it's like this German,
Yeah.
this one right here.
The man who's been
Um,
making sandwiches in front of your face for the
yeah,
last
this
3 years.
this butcher that you've gone to for 20 years, he sank the Lusitania.
Right, your barber.
And yeah, I mean that got us talking about, both of us were fairly young but old enough to know more or less what was going on in the aftermath of September 11th, and seeing just the pretty much blanket hate being put out by I mean white Christian Americans against anyone who wasn't that, and whether there was any sort of connection whatsoever tangentially
Didn't
to
matter.
anyone, it absolutely didn't matter, because you weren't you weren't following all of the guidelines of what it means to be American. The era of uh the Toby Keith song, the boot in your ass song, what's it called, the whatever it's called, that Toby Keith
Is this
song.
I'm proud to be an American, or if I completely fucked that up? Who sings that?
No, I'm Proud to Be American is by Lee Greenwood.
Never mind.
Yeah, but
I'm only laughing because I have no idea what you're talking about. What
yeah,
song?
it's
Go
the
ahead.
Toby Keith song. I think it's called, I gotta find this
Is
out.
it called a boot in your ass? I hope so.
No, that's just the
Oh,
most famous line from it.
that's
Um,
disappointing. I would rename the song.
because he goes, and justice will be served and the battle will rage. This big dog will fight when you rattle his cage.
I'm betting
And
you I've
then,
heard the song one
oh, you
time.
you have to have heard this song, courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue is what it's called.
Courtesy of the red, white, and blue. Is that one? I
He's like,
think so.
put a boot,
Oh my gosh.
Uncle Sam at the top of
Yeah, I think I've heard the song like once
it's
before.
yeah, definitely like that kind of art
Yeah.
was something you could make at that time, and like and not just get like niche acceptance for it. If you made a song like that today, there'd
Ooh,
be
good
like
luck.
some right-wing chuds on the internet who thought it was hilarious, but like it wouldn't get played on the radio, I don't
Yeah, you would hope
think.
that you just simply would not allow that to fly. Like I saw a discussion the other day, similarly, like, do you remember the cartoon Johnny Bravo?
Yes.
Could you imagine trying to make that today?
I
Can you imagine?
I don't I remember watching it. I even remember renting the video game like for PlayStation 1. Um and I this might just be because they don't exist. I don't remember a single plot of an episode. I know I've seen multiple episodes of
I
Johnny
have as
Bravo,
well. I
but
don't
I don't
remember the
know
plots.
what does he like. What does he do? What
His
is
whole
his?
thing was he was a narcissist. So every time he saw a mirror, he'd be like, "Man, I'm pretty." And every time he saw a pretty girl, he would just like basically sexually harass him.
Yeah, like I remember that
That was
part
the
of
whole
it,
plot.
and it's
I
like
think that
I
was the
guess
show.
the fact that I can't remember anything else about it kind of shows how problematic a show like that would
Speaking it
be.
out loud, it sounds like the children's version of like Leisure Suit Larry.
I don't know what that is.
I think it's a video game where you, from what I understand, where you basically just are like a womanizer,
Oh,
pickup artist, gigolo type deal.
yeah, Johnny Bravo was that was a crazy that that show was made.
Well, not only
Um,
that, but it's very again, it's very of its time. Like I hate saying
mhm.
that, where it's like it was like yeah that flew at the time because it was okay, but you couldn't make it unless it was an absolute smackdown parody. But you could not make a show today where that was the whole boast of the main character was
Mhm.
that he's a narcissist who harasses women. It's like
I'm
ah,
I didn't expect to sing Toby Keith when I came on this show.
you're welcome.
Um, I that wasn't in the contract. But it also reminded me. I think it was Alan Jackson who had a song, one of his more Alan Jackson-y, kind of slower, little bit more pensive, reflective, but still just as like crazy to have this worldview. And I remember a line, where he says something like, "I watch CNN which first of all sounds weird from like a right-wing perspective. What right-wingers are watching CNN now?
CNN.
He says, I watch CNN, but I probably can't tell you the difference in Iraq and Iran. And I was like, I was a kid when this came out, and
Not a great boast.
not a very worldly kid. And I remember thinking right away, I was just like, couldn't you learn? Like, that seems easy. Like, you're an adult, you're a grown man, you have a lot of money, you're Alan Jackson, you've sold millions of albums, you have the money, the resources to learn these things. I don't know.
Yeah, when my mom and I were driving when I was moving from Maryland to Texas, we were getting, tired on the road because, driving on the road for a million years. So my mom had a brilliant idea and it worked really well. We started listening to Sean Hannity because we just started getting mad, just yelling at things and getting frustrated and retorting back to the radio. It worked though, because it was just like every time they'd say something, I was like, what are you talking about? Like, how did you get to this conclusion?
Yeah, we grew up in a very it was a very conservative household, so we saw a lot of Fox News. There was a lot of country music, as you can see. And so yeah, I got plenty of exposure to Sean Hannity as a kid. I remember the days of Hannity and Colmes, back when they would trot out Alan Colmes to be his Democratic opponent. Do you remember this?
No.
It was before Sean Hannity was the big name that he became, but it was set up as ostensibly a debate show, but it was on Fox News. And Alan Colmes was just there to be his punching bag, essentially. Yeah, that was a weird time. The time of, Hannity and Colmes, Glenn Beck, being on mainstream television was weird. Saw a lot of Bill O'Reilly.
I haven't heard so many of these names in so long. Rush Limbaugh?
Hey, what's he up to now?
Isn't he dead?
Yeah.
I thought that was a trick question. I was like, is he not?
He's so dead.
I was about to get so disappointed. I was like, really?
No, he's in hell right now.
Good.
But anyway, yeah, all those names, I'm glad that I haven't heard them in a long time. They've
not done anything good, if you're wondering.
They've dispersed out into their own corners of society. I saw the other day Glenn Beck whining about how if woke culture took over, they would limit all Americans to 2,500 calories a day. I was like,
don't you always make fun of woke people for snacking?
I was like, that's an acceptable level of calories. That's medically recommended. But anyway, that's enough about Glenn Beck.
Oh well.
I did want to back to some other cool connections that we have talked about on our show that are cool Titanic connections. Obviously, is Violet Jessup.
Yep.
She's just an amazing story. Just having the kind of life where you have experience with multiple of these ship sinkings. And I want to say this was a detail that Taylor brought up on one of his segments on Lusitania, was how when the ship sank and she was getting into the lifeboat, one of the things she did was I think she ran to the kitchen and she grabbed a handful of rolls because she remembered from Titanic them being in the lifeboats for hours, being cold and hungry. She's like, well, I'm not going to be hungry this time. I know that much. So just having that life experience to deploy in another of these situations is a crazy life to live.
It's pretty bananas.
Yeah, and just the ships that she served, because she was also on the Olympic, and just the experience she had with these ships is amazing. With regard specifically to the movie, also we had Professor Karen Barton on the show. It was a couple months ago, I think. At this point, we had covered the Senegalese ferry La Jolla in, I think, episode 66. That sank in 2002. And that was actually that was one of my favorite parts of the podcast. Was we did this episode on this ferry, and we had used a lot of Professor Barton's stuff. She's one of the only English language sources for this information. And somehow she had come across it and she listened to the episode and she actually liked it, which was a relief when we saw that. And so she was nice enough to come on the show and tell us a little bit more about her experiences with LaJola and, writing the book and doing all the research. And one of the things that she brought up is that when LaJola happened in 2002, the story of the Titanic was very prevalent in people's minds because it had just recently been released in France. I guess the French, I don't know. I don't know if it was the French dubbed version or what, but it had become more accessible. And so many of the people would have seen it or known about it more so than they did before. And so then that happened shortly after that. And so they sort of got their own version of the Titanic, unfortunately, which is
what a horrible present.
Yeah, which is something we bring up a lot, is that Titanic being such a hulking presence in shipwreck discourse. Anytime there's a major accident, everything becomes the Titanic of the LaJola is Africa's Titanic. Doña Paz, people call it, Asia's Titanic.
Titanic.
And so Titanic sort of muscles out all of the other vessels, and even something that's totally unrelated, its name gets stuck onto it. And in many cases, these are far deadlier incidents than the Titanic, but just because of the cultural recognition it has, everything is compared to it.
Bill Burr does a segment where he makes the same point, but about Hitler. He's like, whenever you talk about bad people, it's always like the next Hitler. He's like, first of all, who did they compare people to before Hitler? And second of all, do you think Mussolini is mad that we don't use him?
since he was technically first?
Yeah, and it's the same kind of concept where it's like, obviously it's like this is a joke way where it's kind of like, but if you kind of always compare something to other things, it never gets its recognition on its own. If you don't recognize it on its own, you don't, in my opinion, quite learn properly.
Yeah, and I think part of that is kind of similar to how I felt a little bit about Lusitania before we did it. Was I know this story, like I know what happened to the Lusitania, and then like I absolutely didn't even know like 5% of what happened. And I feel like by doing that, by taking the Titanic and applying it to these other things, it sort of encourages people to not read more about it. It's like, oh, I know this story. I know what happens in a shipwreck. I know lots of people died, whatever. When you have all these different, the different contexts for these things to happen, like with LaJola, the reason that so many people are using this ferry for transit is because of civil strife in Senegal and in the Gambia, and they can't go directly over land.
Yeah.
And so you've got this ferry that's, overloaded, and that's why you've got so many students on board, which always makes the stories harder, like with the Seawall ferry.
I was about to say, this sounds like the Seawall ferry.
Yeah. And that just adds in all those complications. But yeah, I think Titanic is it expands to fill its container. It just kind of covers everything. And like you obviously understand why, because of the impact it had. Like nothing will probably replace it or stop that from happening. But yeah, it definitely makes its presence felt in the industry.
I mean, I have a whole podcast dedicated to it, so obviously.
Right. Yeah, and everyone, like, whenever we mention that we have a shipwrecks podcast, people are like, "Are you going to
Titanic?"
And we always say no. And
I think you should go out of your way to not cover Titanic.
And that's kind of always been our thing. Like it's done. Like there are people who devote far more time and energy to it, and can have a lot more interesting things to say about it. People who have researched it and really are invested, because it is a community on its own.
It is.
And yeah, it doesn't really fit what we would want to do. We like feeling that we can add something to a conversation, and there are plenty of great people doing that with Titanic. Like this podcast I'm on right now. So yeah, it's one we have to unfortunately say no. We'll probably never do something just directly about the sinking of the Titanic. But we do get to talk about it quite a lot with all of our other episodes. We actually have one that I've been chipping away at very, very slowly for
Did
like
you just
months,
say chipping away at?
No, but I should have.
I was going to feel like impressed.
That would have been a good one. Called the Hans Hedtoft. I don't know if you're familiar with this one.
It sounds like a
It's
person whose cooking I'd really like.
I want to I want to say I want to say it was Danish.
That sounds,
It
if not
sank
Danish, it's decidedly Scandinavian.
it sank in the 50s.
Also, more modern.
And it's the if I remember this correctly, it sank in January 1959 off of Greenland. And there's some eerie connections to the Titanic. Um, Also sank on her maiden voyage,
Mm.
and she is the last recorded passenger vessel to sink with casualties after hitting an iceberg. So, some major Titanic connections there.
Wait, it's been since then.
Mhm.
Really? Well, I mean, we
Yeah,
also have fewer icebergs now, so
yeah. So it recorded as the last known ship sunk by an
okay,
iceberg
known. There we go.
with casualties, and also I'm assuming
Still.
that that's taking into account some things because like we've talked about, fishing vessels and things that encounter
Yeah.
ice. I'm sure some of them have sunk with casualties due to ice.
This is a passenger vessel.
Right. So this may be only looking at like
Probably.
technically ships.
But I'm still thinking like that's pretty.
And I think it says a lot about the technology and probably also the
Mhm.
survivability of ships now,
Mhm.
in terms of being able to detect these things beforehand. Um, and yeah, it's really interesting to see what problems no longer really plague ships that used to, for centuries, and what problems still exist.
Yeah.
Because, one reason the Edmund Fitzgerald is such a presence, obviously because of the song, but
Great song.
one of the reasons that it generated so much of that is because 1975, we shouldn't be losing freighters on the Great Lakes. In 1975, we
And
have
its
all the
entire crew, no
we've got
survivors.
we've got we've got radio, we've got planes, helicopters, all this stuff. How are we losing a ship with like no trace of what happened to it? And that was at this point a long time ago, but big ships still sink and still have problems. There was obviously things like the Costa Concordia,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't know if we'll touch that one. That one's been discussed quite a bit too.
That's a big one.
But yeah, it's amazing to see these things still happen to these big ships that should theoretically be safe, and we should know what we're doing by now. But things always happen. Things always keep happening.
They do, and we'll never be able to prevent them because nature is a force.
Yeah, and there's that, and then with all of the technological and safety advances, like they're useless if people aren't employing them. We talked about the Carina Sea, an incident where it wasn't a shipwreck, but it was a crushing incident involving the crane. And you've got safety measures in place. You've got, we know how we're supposed to be doing these things and the process that we're supposed to follow. But if people aren't following them, it's still going to see accidents. So they're getting better, but they're more or less unavoidable, which I guess in a way keeps us in business as a podcast.
And that's true. But Tanner, thank you so much for coming on and talking somewhat about Titanic, somewhat about shipwrecks, and mostly about a bunch of other stuff.
Right. Thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this.
It was fun. Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to give a huge thank you again to Tanner for coming on my show. And you can get in touch with Tanner and the Beyond the Breakers podcast, which you should be listening to, by the way. Go ahead and follow them on Twitter. That's Beyond Breakers, BEYOND_breakers. And you can follow them on Instagram at, I had something come up. Beyond the Breakers podcast, all one word, Beyond the Breakers podcast on Instagram, and look them up wherever you listen to your podcast. Be sure to listen to them, and I'll see you next time. Bye.